in Genesis. That's where we begin our study today. Chapter 47. Jacob has made it to Egypt, to the land of Goshen, and got everything settled down. He is one happy man. Met his son Joseph, that for 20 years or so he had thought that Joseph was dead. So it's quite a gathering, quite a reunion. And verse 47, uh, then Joseph, or chapter 47, excuse me, chapter 47, verse 1, then Joseph came and told Pharaoh and said, my father and my brethren and their flocks and their herds and all that they have are come out of the land of Canaan, and behold, they are in the land of Goshen. Must have been a great delight for Joseph. He's governor, he's second in command to Pharaoh, to come to the Pharaoh and to make Pharaoh to know that, let him know that his father and his whole family, they're all here now, and they're settled in this country of Goshen. In verse 2, he took some of his brethren, even 5 men, and presented them unto Pharaoh. Now, this also is quite interesting that Joseph picked out 5 of his brothers. He wanted to introduce them to Pharaoh, or maybe vice versa, introduce Pharaoh to them. He would wait until later to bring his father to introduce him to Pharaoh. Possibly he wanted the matter settled concerning the shepherd issue, that Joseph, he had told his brothers what to say and what not to say, because he said to the Egyptians, the shepherds are despicable. Anyway, Moses, he does not inform us who these 5 brothers were. So it's left to our imagination, our speculation, as to which of the 11 brothers of Joseph that he chose to introduce to Pharaoh. Some have gone so far as to give us an idea of who the 5 were, but again, it's supposition. For instance, John Gill, he says 5 men whom the Targum of Jonathan names as follow: Zebulun, Dan, and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. But Harkey will have them to be Reuben, Simeon, and Levi, Issachar, and Benjamin. But on these accounts, no dependence is to be had. So Mr. Gill as well says, even if we go to the Jewish Targum, and to the Jewish writers, and they're supposing, they're surmising, but we don't really know who the 5 were. In verse 3, Pharaoh said unto his brethren, what is your occupation? And they said unto Pharaoh, thy servants are shepherds, both we and also our fathers. Now, Joseph, plainly, we read in the previous chapter that Joseph had warned them that shepherds were an abomination to the Egyptians. So they did not waver in informing, telling Pharaoh that was what they were. That's what we are. Let's not cover it up or hide it. It was never any benefit to lie. There is never in this century, in the year of 2025, it's never benefit to us to lie, regardless of the expected result. We need to be truthful. And I think that's what was happening here. They said, moreover, unto Pharaoh, for to sojourn in the land are we come. For thy servants have no pasture for their flocks, for the famine is sore in the land of Canaan, Now therefore, we pray thee, let thy servants dwell in the land of Goshen. Let me borrow again from John Gill. He says, he quotes, to sojourn in the land are we come, not to obtain possessions and inheritance as if natives, and to abide there always, but to continue for a little time, for they kept in mind that the land of Canaan was given to them as an inheritance and would be possessed by them in due time, and therefore had no thought for the present of continuing here long. The comments of Gill, and I can agree with them. Their home was Canaan. It might be that they can't live there now and survive well, and so they're blessed because they have a big brother or a brother. He is big, not physically, but he is big in his stature of position and importance. Verses 5 and 6, Pharaoh spake unto Joseph, saying, thy father and thy brother are come unto thee. The land of Egypt is before thee. In the best of the land, make thy father and brethren to dwell. In the land of Goshen, let them dwell. And if thou knowest any men of activity among them, make them rulers over my cattle. Again, interesting. Let me borrow from Mr. Clark, Adam Clark. He writes, if every shepherd was an abomination to the Egyptians, however we may understand or qualify the expression, is it to be supposed that Pharaoh should desire that the brethren of his prime minister, of his chief favorite, should be employed in some of the very meanest offices in the land? We may therefore safely understand Pharaoh as expressing his will that the brethren of Joseph should be appointed as overseers or superintendents of his domestic concerns, while Joseph superintended those of the state. That's a good opinion and way of looking at it. In verse 7, Joseph brought in Jacob, his father, and set him before Pharaoh. And Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Now, this is interesting. Jacob blessed Pharaoh. To me, it's a very interesting meeting. Here are two, Jacob, Pharaoh. Here is a man who has come to Egypt because he's run out of food in the land where he's been living, Canaan. He's standing before the Pharaoh himself, who is responsible for the food that he's received. And yet Moses said Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Jacob blessed Pharaoh. The patriarch, Jacob, blessed the Pharaoh, the great leader of all Egypt. As a child of God, we have no reason at any time to look down, to feel neglected, to feel smaller, to feel insufficient. As a child of God, we don't have to take a second seat, if you will, or a back seat to anyone in position. We expect to be honored and recognized as a child of God because of our new birth experience. But at the same time, we respect those in position, in authority. In fact, we are very plainly told in the New Testament to give honor to whom honor is due, that we are to pray for those in position and authority. Now, here in America, the President of the United States he's the head of it all. He is the head of it all. And it so happens the one we have now is a good one. But anyway, He is president. We recognize his position, but that does not demean us. We're a child of God. And so Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Position-wise, Pharaoh was over the whole country. Moses said Jacob blessed Pharaoh. Now, as a child of God, again, let me reemphasize, we're in a unique position. We're chosen, and we must not feel humiliated by any that are in authority, regardless of who they are. And we have a good example of that in the New Testament concerning the apostles and concerning Jesus Christ himself. You know, when Paul was before the king and those that were accusing him, can't get my mind together right here straight, but if you recall, Paul referred to him as a whited sepulcher. And somebody, he was before the Sanhedrin, and somebody slapped him and said, "Don't you know you're talking to the high priest?" Evidently, the high priest was not dressed in his high priestly robe or garments, and Paul apologized and recognized his position as high priest, that he was to be honored for his position. Anyway, let me borrow from Matthew Henry. He writes, "With the gravity of old age, the piety of a true believer, and the authority of a patriarch and a prophet, Jacob besought the Lord to bestow a blessing upon Pharaoh. He acted as a man not ashamed of his religion, and who would express gratitude to the benefactor of himself and his family." We have here a very uncommon answer given to a common question. Jacob calls his life a pilgrimage, the sojourning of a stranger in a foreign country, or his journey home to his own country. He was not at home upon earth. His habitation, his inheritance, his treasures were in heaven. Matthew Henry. In verse 8 and 9, Pharaoh said unto Jacob, "How old art thou?" And Jacob said unto Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have the days of the years of my life been, and have not attained unto the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimage." My pilgrimage. Just like his father, Isaac, and his grandfather, Abraham, he considered himself a pilgrim. This country is not my home. He would own no possession in the promised land of Canaan, except what Abraham bought for their burying place. He was among that group that the Hebrews writer speaks about that were seeking a city. Now, although Jacob was 130 years of age, he had not, and he would not, attain the age of his father, 180 years, as we read in chapter 35 and verse 28 of Genesis. Or his grandfather, Abraham, he was 175 years when he died, that we read in Genesis 25 and verse 7. Jacob, as we shall see as we continue our study, he will die as the youngest among them, only 147 years old. I say only. He was died younger than his father or grandfather. In verse 10, Jacob blessed Pharaoh and went out from before Pharaoh. So Jacob, he again pronounces a blessing upon his benefactor. And then he goes to Goshen, where he's going to live among his children, his grandchildren, for 17 more years. And we have no reason and no scripture to see or read or think that Jacob would ever meet Pharaoh again. No reference to it. In verse 11, Joseph placed his father and his brethren and gave them a possession in the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had commanded. The best of the land. That's interesting. The Egyptians, after they'd given all their money for the corn that they had gotten from Joseph, after they'd given all their animals for corn, so they're alone, they're broke, I guess we could say. And then they would give themselves for corn, and then they would become controlled and move to any area of Egypt where Joseph and Pharaoh wanted to send them. But when the reason I emphasize that is that Jacob and his family would live in the choice area of Egypt where the land was fertile and would supply their needs, evidently. That it seems that's what I'm gleaning out of this study, that Goshen was not affected as the rest of Egypt, or it seems that way. Now, verse 12 says, Joseph nourished his father and his brethren and all his father's household with bread according to their families. So we ask a question. Was Joseph prejudiced with this kind of action? Well, he was governor of the land, and I think this would give him the authority to allow his family to live and be given food at his choice, as he would choose this. Again, Mr. Gill says, for though there might be in Ramesses pasture sufficient for their cattle, yet not corn for their families. The famine still continuing, during which time Joseph, as a dutiful and affectionate son and as a kind brother, supplied them with all necessary provision, signified by bread. That's Mr. Gill's thoughts on this. But anyway, in verse 13, in verse 13, there was no bread in all the land, for the famine was very sore, so that the land of Egypt and all the land of Canaan fainted by reason of the famine. So from what we can glean, it looks like that the entire country, which would include Goshen. Jameson Fawcett Brown comments, this probably refers to the second year of the famine, when any little stores of individuals or families were exhausted, and when the people had become universally dependent on the government. At first, they obtained supplies for payment. Before long, money failed. In verse 14, Joseph gathered up all the money that was found in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan for the corn which they bought. And Joseph brought the money into Pharaoh's house. Interesting. Now, the result of what took place as the people began to give their money, they had to purchase corn for their family until their money ran out. Sounds kind of prophetic. Things are going to get tough one of these days when the enemy takes over, as it were, the man of sin, the beast. And we read about what we read about in Revelation 13, 16, 17, and 18 about being able to purchase food without a mark, without a number or name, will be deprived. unless you're identified and become part of the group. But anyway, this is awesome to consider. All the money of the Egyptians is now in the, I guess we'll say, the bank, the coffers of Pharaoh. Verse 15, when the money failed in the land of Egypt and in the land of Canaan, all the Egyptians came unto Joseph and said, give us bread, for why should we die in thy presence, for the money faileth. So it had been all spent in the third, the fourth, the fifth years of famine. And now we're getting desperate now. Verse 16 and 17, Joseph said, give your cattle, and I'll give you for your cattle if money fail. And they brought their cattle unto Joseph. Joseph gave them bread in exchange for horses and for the flocks and for the cattle of the herds and for the asses, and he fed them with bread for all their cattle for that year. Well, the next step after their money is all gone is then all their cattle. Now, we have a question here. Where did Joseph place all those cattle, all that cattle and flocks and herds? Where are these animals that Jacob's sons would be called upon to care for? Where would they be placed? If they can't raise food because of the famine, then how are the cattle going to survive? It's a question in my mind. I'm looking for an answer. In verses 18 and 19, when that year was ended, they came unto him the second year and said unto him, we will not hide it from my Lord, how that our money is spent. My Lord also hath our herds of cattle. There is not aught left in the sight of my Lord, but our bodies and our lands. Wherefore shall we die before thine eyes, both we and our land? Buy us and our land for bread, and we and our land shall be servants unto Pharaoh, and give us seed that we may live and not die, that the land be not desolate. So the next step, complete control, possession of the people. Now, it says the second year here in this statement, in this passage. It's not referring to the second year of the famine, but the second year after the last exchange of corn, which was their cattle. And this was probably the seventh year of the famine. Probably, I wondered this. And so they're asking for seed to sow their fields. Why do they need seed if the famine is not coming to a close? And they know it was to last 7 years according to the prophecy. But anyway, so they had hope, evidently. If you'll give us seed, the famine's going to be over, and we'll be able to plant seed wherever we're living. In verse 20, Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for the Egyptians sold every man his field, because the famine prevailed over them, so the land became Pharaoh's. Now, so Pharaoh, he now has all their money, he has all of their cattle, and now he has all of their field, all of their lands. In verse 21, as for the people, he removed them to cities from one end of the borders of Egypt, even to the other end thereof. He removed them. This statement, he removed them to cities. He removed them to cities. This statement has led several commentators to suggest that Joseph did this to bring the people closer to where the corn had been stored in the cities throughout Egypt. This would make it easier for the people to have access to the corn rather than just have to travel at a long distance living out in the country somewhere. But it could also mean that the people could be better controlled close to the cities rather than having them living miles from the cities where he placed them. So again, suppositions here. He removed them regardless to the places, the cities that he wanted them to live in. In verse 22, all of the land of the priests bought he not, for the priests had a portion assigned them of Pharaoh, and did eat their portion which Pharaoh gave them, wherefore they sold not their lands. So they didn't buy the land of the priests, or didn't take the land of the priests. They were already subjects of the state. All we must do is read about what happened when the priests, the soothsayers, the magicians didn't agree with something good for the king, or in this case, Pharaoh. Now, Mr. Clark says, he makes I think, an interesting point here. He said, this is the earliest account we have of an established religion supported by the state. So Pharaoh, he's got control of the preacher as well. In verse 23, then Joseph said unto the people, behold, I have bought you this day in your land for Pharaoh. Lo, here is seed for you, and you shall sow the land. Ye shall sow the land. Now, the problem, maybe a problem, with this statement is that it's no longer their land they're sowing. So that's a problem. They will sow the land, but it's not theirs. A portion of this land, when the harvest comes, it's going to go to Pharaoh. In verse 24, shall come to pass in the increase that ye shall give the fifth part unto Pharaoh, 4 parts shall be your own, for seed of the field, for your food, and for them of your households, and for food for your little ones. And they said, verse 25, thou hast saved our lives. Let us find grace in the sight of my Lord, and we will be Pharaoh's servants. Verse 26, Joseph made it a law over the land of Egypt unto this day that Pharaoh should have the fifth part, except the land of the priests only, which became not Pharaoh's. And then in conclusion, verse 27, beginning, Israel dwelt in the land of Egypt in the country of Goshen. They had possessions therein and grew and multiplied exceedingly. Jacob lived in the land of Egypt 17 years. So the whole age of Jacob was 147 years. And verse 29, and the time drew nigh that Israel must die. And he called his son Joseph and said unto him, if now I have found grace in thy sight, put, I pray thee, thy hand under my thigh, and deal kindly and truly with me. Bury me not, I pray thee, in Egypt. In verse 30 and 31, but I will lie with my fathers, and thou shalt carry me out of Egypt and bury me in their burying place. And he said, I will do as thou hast said. And he said, the last verse, 31, swear unto me. And he sware unto him, and Israel bowed himself upon the bed's head. What a time. The patriarch, old and tired, his journey had taken him physically as well as emotionally to bring him to a tired position and condition. And now he's giving some instructions to Joseph, his favorite, and telling him, don't bury me in Egypt. Take me back home. Very interesting story that we find here in this chapter 47. So This world is not my home either. What about you? We're going to a better place. Thank God for his promises. Thank God for his word. That concludes our study today and this week. God bless you, Sister Jacqueline. May